Welcome back to another deep dive.
Hello, everyone.
I know we always start by asking you to hit that like button and subscribe to the show, but today I really mean it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You are going to want to have this discussion saved and in your feed. We are diving into a topic that touches literally every aspect of our society. And we're using a source text that completely rewired how I look at the world.
It's a powerful one.
It is. It's a brilliant new ebook called Escaping the Poverty Trap, a comprehensive look at socioeconomic challenges in the UK by Conrad Riker. Now, before we even get into the weeds, I highly recommend you open up another tab right now and grab a copy on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
Strongly recommend that.
And while you're at it, you should follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. I'm not just saying that to hype it up either. The insights we are about to explore are so deeply relevant to how our modern world functions that you're going to want to read the source material for yourself. We're going to unpack why poverty isn't just about an empty wallet. It's a systemic psychological and physical labyrinth.
It truly is a labyrinth, and I think that's the perfect word for it. When we talk about poverty, especially in the context of a wealthy, developed nation like the United Kingdom, the immediate default assumption for a lot of people is that it's simply a math problem.
Right, just a lack of financial resources.
And exactly. But Riker's book serves as a masterclass in demonstrating why that perspective is fundamentally incomplete. We aren't just going to look at the surface level symptoms today. We need to dissect exactly why poverty persists across generations. Why does it defy all these seemingly obvious, easy solutions?
Yeah.
How does it trap millions in a cycle that feels almost engineered to be inescapable? This text gives us the ultimate roadmap to answering those questions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because understand where we are, we have to start at the foundation. We need to look at the historical roots of poverty in the UK, because society hasn't always viewed this issue the way we do today.
No, definitely not.
Riker takes us on this fascinating historical journey, starting back in the Victorian era. And back then, the societal lens was incredibly harsh. Poverty was largely seen as a moral failing.
Yes.
If you were poor, the assumption wasn't that the economy was bad or that you had bad luck. Society essentially viewed your poverty as a direct reflection of a defect in your character. It was seen as a lack of spiritual redemption, a lack of personal discipline, or just inherent laziness. That's the era of the workhouses where conditions were intentionally made miserable to deter people from seeking help.
Exactly. The underlying philosophy of the poor laws was deterrence. The belief was that if you made relief too comfortable, the working classes would simply choose not to work.
Wow.
It was a highly individualized view of destitution. But then, as Riker points out, we move into the 20th century, and there is this massive structural and ideological shift. We see the gradual dissolution of those old punitive poor laws, largely driven by empirical research.
Right, the data started coming in.
You get groundbreaking, meticulously detailed works like Charles Booth's Poverty in London. Booth actually went out and mapped the city street by street, color-coding them by income and social class. He provided sheer, undeniable data showing that destitution in the city wasn't just a few lazy individuals, it was a massive structural reality. And that paved the way for the Beveridge Report in the 1940s.
Right, the Beveridge Report is huge here. It fundamentally laid the groundwork for the entire modern welfare state in the UK. William Beveridge identified what he called the 5 giants on the road to Reconstruction. 1. Disease ignorance, squalor, and idleness.
Just naming them like that changes the whole framing.
It totally does. It shifted the narrative away from blaming the individual and placed the responsibility squarely on the structure of society itself.
Right.
The government had a duty to slay those giants.
And that shift is inherently tied to a deeply philosophical concept that underpins our entire modern civilization, the societal contract.
Yeah.
This is a concept heavily debated by classical philosophers. Essentially, it proposes that individuals agree to surrender certain absolute natural freedoms in exchange for the protection order and mutual benefit provided by a governed society. Think of Thomas Hobbes, who believed human nature was inherently chaotic and selfish, so we needed a strong, absolute authority, a leviathan, to prevent chaos and violence.
Yep.
On the flip side, you have John Locke, who championed a more democratic system based on the mutual protection of natural rights like life, liberty, and property.
So under Locke's view, society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. We all play by the rules, we all pay our taxes, and in return, the system gives us a baseline of security and opportunity.
Precisely. But here is where Riker makes a deeply compelling point. Extreme economic disparity fundamentally breaks the societal contract. When a society is structured in a way where immense, unimaginable wealth concentrates at the very top, while a significant portion at the bottom struggles to merely survive, the fundamental promise of mutual benefit is shattered. Why should the people at the bottom agree to the rules of a game that they have literally no chance of winning?
They wouldn't.
Right. The societal contract risks becoming a hollow, weaponized promise for those trapped in poverty.
And when you look at the actual numbers illustrating this broken contract, they're just staggering. It's not just an abstract philosophical debate. There's a statistic from the Institute for Fiscal Studies cited in the text that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Let's hear it.
The income of the richest 1% in the UK is more than 15 times that of the poorest 20%. And it gets infinitely crazier when you zoom out and look at overall accumulated wealth, not just annual income.
The wealth gap is always wider.
It is. The wealthiest 10% own nearly half the nation's total wealth. Half. When you hear data like that, the idea of an equal societal contract feels completely divorced from reality. It feels like two different species living on the same landmass.
It does. And this naturally brings us to the core economic and political debates about how to fix that broken contract, which the text explores with rigorous impartiality. I want to be clear, we aren't taking sides here, just reporting the text.
Of course.
On one side of the spectrum, you have the proponents of free market capitalism. Their argument is that the best way to honor the societal contract is through deregulation, prioritizing individual enterprise, and allowing the market to dictate the distribution of resources.
It's a trickle-down approach.
Essentially, yes. The core belief here is that wealth generation at the top will eventually spur innovation, create jobs, and raise the standard of living for the entire society. A rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak.
But the critics of that approach would argue that the tide only lifts the yachts right. That relying purely on the free market often exacerbates the exact income inequality we are talking about, leading to monopolies and wage stagnation for the working class.
Exactly. And on the other side of that spectrum, you have socialist policies aimed at aggressive wealth redistribution. This approach argues for a more equitable, guaranteed sharing of resources, prioritizing collective welfare over unchecked individual accumulation.
Right.
The argument is that the state must step in to artificially rebalance the scales to ensure the societal contract remains intact. Yet critics of those socialist policies argue forcefully that aggressive taxation and redistribution can stifle economic growth, disincentivize innovation, and infringe upon the individual liberty to enjoy the fruits of one's own labor.
So it's a massive push and pull.
The ultimate challenge for any modern society is navigating the tension between these differing ideologies. How do you find a structure that respects individual freedoms and economic dynamism while actually delivering on the baseline societal welfare promised by the contract?
It's a massive tightrope walk. But while those macro-level philosophical and economic debates are crucial for policy, what really got me while reading this ebook is how this broken contract plays out in the minute-by-minute lived reality of individuals.
It's exhausting.
It is. Because when you're in it, it's not a debate over tax brackets or Hobbes versus Locke. It's a heavy, suffocating, constant psychological burden. This leads us to part 2 of our deep dive. Riker emphasizes that poverty is not just an empty wallet. It is an overwhelming cognitive weight. In the book, he references this incredible paradigm-shifting research by Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir on the cognitive load of scarcity.
That research is truly foundational. The cognitive load theory fundamentally changes how we view decision-making in poverty.
It really does. For anyone who hasn't heard this term, let me explain how the book breaks it down. Imagine your brain is a computer. You have a certain amount of RAM or processing power available at any given time to make decisions, plan for the future, or solve problems.
Right, a limited bandwidth.
Exactly. When you are constantly stressed about where your next meal is coming from, or how you'll keep the electricity on, or if you can afford your kids' shoes, those worries are like massive, heavy software programs running constantly in the background. They are eating up all your RAM.
So there's nothing left over.
Yes. So your actual mental bandwidth, your capacity for critical thinking and long-term planning is drastically measurably reduced. You are literally functioning with less cognitive capacity because the stress of survival is monopolizing your brain.
What's fascinating here is how this immense cognitive load interacts with the internalized societal messaging we were talking about earlier. You don't just have the stress of bills, you have the stress of how society views you.
That's stigma.
The text delves deeply into two highly destructive psychological phenomena that arise from this: learned helplessness and cognitive dissonance. Learned helplessness is a concept originally observed in animal psychology, but profoundly applicable here.
How so?
It occurs when an individual faces repeated uncontrollable negative events. If you are in systemic poverty and every time you try to save money, your car breaks down or your rent gets hiked or your hours get cut, eventually your brain conditions itself to stop trying. You genuinely begin to believe your actions will have no effect on your outcomes. You stop fighting the current.
That is heartbreaking. And then you combine that with cognitive dissonance.
Yes. Cognitive dissonance occurs when a person holds contradictory beliefs or values. An individual in poverty might inherently know their own worth, their own intelligence, their own capability. But they live in a society that constantly broadcasts messages, branding them as inferior, lazy, or incapable strictly due to their socioeconomic status.
We see that everywhere.
We see this in media representation and political rhetoric. Reconciling I am a capable person with working through, society treats me like a failure, creates a massive internal psychological conflict.
And how do they resolve it?
To resolve that dissonance, many individuals tragically internalize the societal message. They begin to believe the negative hype. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, absolutely destroying their self-esteem, their internal motivation, and their aspirations.
And understanding that psychological warfare completely shifts how you view certain behaviors. It leads directly to actions that people on the outside looking at emotion, people who aren't carrying that cognitive load, often judge incredibly harshly. Riker brings up the work of behavioral economist Dan O'Reilly in Predictably Irrational. He discusses concepts like temptation bundling and hyperbolic discounting.
Hyperbolic discounting is a critical concept to grasp if we want to move past judging the poor and start understanding the mechanics of poverty.
Let's walk through it. Imagine a person living in deep grinding poverty. By some stroke of luck, they get a tiny bit of extra cash, maybe a small tax return or a holiday bonus.
Right, a rare windfall.
The strictly rational economic advice, the advice someone with a comfortable middle-class savings account would give, is to put it in an emergency fund or pay down a fraction of a high-interest debt. But instead, that person might go out and buy a shiny new smartphone or take their family out for an expensive, nice dinner.
And the judgment is instant.
Exactly. From the outside, the reaction is immediate judgment. Look at those terrible financial choices. That's why they're poor. But hyperbolic discounting explains the actual neuroscience behind this. A stress-depleted brain heavily disproportionately prioritizes immediate dopamine hits over abstract, distant future gains.
Precisely. When your baseline reality is constant deprivation and your view of the future is endlessly bleak and insecure, the promise of compound interest in 10 years means absolutely nothing.
That's nothing at all.
That immediate reward, that brief fleeting moment of feeling normal, of feeling successful, or simply providing a moment of joy for your children is psychologically irresistible. It is a completely natural human biological response to an unnatural, punishing, and chronically stressful environment.
It's like criticizing someone dying of thirst in the desert for drinking a soda instead of investing the money in a water filtration plant. The immediacy of the need overrides the long-term logic.
That's an apt analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of escaping the poverty trap, it becomes glaringly obvious that purely economic solutions, just tweaking tax credits or adjusting minimum wage by a few pence, aren't enough on their own. We have to concurrently address the psychological damage.
Right.
The text points to the study of positive psychology to find a way forward, specifically highlighting the work of researchers like Poggle and the University of Pennsylvania regarding resilience and grit.
Right, grit. The ability to persevere through immense difficulty over a long period.
Exactly. Their research found that individuals with measurably high levels of resilience and grit are significantly more likely to achieve upward social mobility despite systemic barriers. But, and this is the crucial caveat that Riker emphasizes, this resilience does not exist in a vacuum.
You can't just tell someone to be grittier.
You cannot simply mandate that people develop grit. It requires robust community support, secure attachments, and social capital. It requires environments that foster hope. Therefore, integrating mental health support, community building, and psychological interventions into systemic poverty alleviation programs is absolutely essential. You have to help individuals overcome that cognitive load before they can utilize any economic opportunities you might provide.
But the tragedy is that the burden isn't just in the mind. If your brain is constantly running on empty just to survive, your body is absorbing all of that collateral damage. The mind and body are inextricably connected. This bridges us perfectly into part 3, the physical realities of the poverty trap.
The health lottery.
Yes, we're talking about health nutrition and what the book chillingly calls the postcode lottery. I want you, the listener, to prepare yourself because this statistic from the Institute of Health Equity is staggering. In the UK today, men in the lowest income bracket have a life expectancy 10 years shorter than the highest earners.
10 years.
An entire decade of human life wiped out simply because of where they fall on the socioeconomic ladder.
It is a devastating reality, and it lays bare the brutal mechanics of the health lottery effect. Your zip code or your postcode essentially dictates your access to the fundamental physical building blocks of a healthy human life. Let's break down what that means on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Your postcode determines your proximity to safe green spaces for exercise. It determines whether your local area has grocery stores selling affordable, fresh, nutritious produce, or if you live in a food desert where the only accessible calories are highly processed, cheap, sodium-rich options from corner stores. Furthermore, it often dictates your access to quality, timely healthcare facilities and specialists.
And when you're constantly stressed, pumping out cortisol and eating highly processed food because it's all you can afford or all you have the energy to prepare after working a double shift chronic illness is an inevitability. It's not a lack of willpower. It's a biological consequence.
Exactly. And the economic burden of the chronic illnesses that inevitably arise from these toxic environments is massive, creating its own subtrap. For the working poor, managing a chronic illness creates a vicious cycle. You have the phenomenon of presenteeism, which is going to work sick, in pain, or exhausted because you cannot afford to lose a day's wages.
I've seen that so many times.
You are less productive, you risk making mistakes, and you prolong your illness. On the other end, you have absenteeism, missing work entirely due to severe health flare-ups, which directly jeopardizes your fragile income and puts you at risk of termination.
And the debt.
Yes. In many systems, particularly outside the UK, like in the US, this is compounded by the crushing, inescapable weight of medical debt pushing families directly into bankruptcy.
But the book goes even further than the immediate environment. It dives into how poverty actually alters human biology on a cellular level. I was completely captivated by the section on epigenetics. For those who aren't familiar, epigenetics is this cutting-edge scientific field. Basically, if your DNA is the hardware of your body, your epigenome is the software that tells the hardware what to do.
It switches genes on and off.
Right, it determines which genes get switched on and which get switched off. Riker explores research showing how the environmental trauma of poverty, the constant ambient stress, the poor maternal diet, the exposure to industrial pollution, often concentrated in poor neighborhoods, can physically alter that epigenetic software.
It is a profound shift in how we understand generational poverty. It means that a child born into a poverty-stricken environment might be genetically predisposed from the moment of birth due to the epigenetic changes triggered by their parents' stress to a host of ailments.
That's terrifying.
They are statistically more likely to develop obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and severe mental health issues. The poverty trap isn't just a metaphor, it is literally written into their biology.
That is just wild to think about. The trauma of poverty is hereditary on a molecular level.
It highlights the absolute urgency of innovative, localized healthcare solutions that intervene early. Riker outlines this by looking at successful models globally, refusing to accept that this is an unsolvable problem. He points to initiatives like the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, which focuses intensely on the very beginning of life.
Getting ahead of it.
It ensures proper maternal nutrition, infant care, and breastfeeding support to try and mitigate early biological disparities before they take root. He also highlights a fascinating model from Ethiopia, the jar villages.
Right, I love this part. What are the jar villages?
In these setups lay community health workers. People from the community itself, not expensive outside doctors, are rigorously trained to provide basic critical preventative care, maternal support, and health education within deeply underserved remote areas.
That's brilliant.
Now, if you imagine applying the ethos of those models to marginalized communities in the UK or the US, it's revolutionary. Imagine creating robust networks of community-trained health workers who intimately understand the specific cultural nuances, linguistic barriers, and environmental challenges of their own neighborhoods. They could act as a bridge between the clinical healthcare system and the daily realities of the impoverished, completely revolutionizing healthcare access and compliance.
So what does this all mean? If we take all of this, the historical punitive roots, a broken societal contract, the crushing cognitive load, and the literal biological deterioration of the body, what does this mean for the daily grind of the individual? It entirely dismantles the most pervasive myth about poverty, the idea that simply getting a job is the cure.
The paradox of the working poor.
Yes. Part 4 of this deep dive looks at the paradox of the working poor and the systemic barriers that keep them trapped. regardless of their work ethic. We have to kill the narrative that poor people just don't want to work. The text gives us incredibly vivid, heartbreaking case studies. Let's talk about James.
James's situation is emblematic of millions.
Exactly. Riker profiles James, a guy who works two jobs. He is a janitor by night and a fast food worker by day. He is putting in 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks. The physical exhaustion is unimaginable. But because he is trapped in low-wage hourly work, subject to unpredictable scheduling, his massive output of labor barely covers his basic survival needs.
Right.
When you do the math on his minimum wage income versus the cost of groceries, utilities, and a basic phone plan so his boss can call him in, it leaves absolutely zero capacity to save. There's no emergency fund. If his car breaks down, his entire life collapses.
And then there's the housing crisis, which acts as a massive accelerant to the poverty trap. The text introduces Jack, a single father.
Jack's story broke my heart. Jack has entirely given up on the dream of ever owning a home.
Why?
Because the median rent in his area of England consumes 2/3 of his income. 2/3
It's unsustainable.
every single month before he has bought a single calorie of food for his kid, paid for a drop of heating oil, or bought a bus pass to get to work. 66% of his labor value vanishes into his landlord's pocket. How are you supposed to build a life, let alone accumulate generational wealth, with the remaining third? You are just treading water with weights tied to your ankles. And Riker points out this is uniquely exacerbated for those trapped in rural poverty.
Rural poverty is often overlooked because poverty is frequently visualized as an urban issue. But in rural areas, geographic isolation forms invisible walls around an individual's potential.
Like the lack of infrastructure.
Public transportation is often non-existent, meaning you must own a car to work. If you are too poor to afford a car or the repairs on an old one, your job prospects shrink to walking distance. High transportation costs and the lack of local infrastructure create a stagnant economic pond.
But the walls aren't just geographic or economic. And here's where we need to look at the data impartially. Riker makes it clear that these economic walls are frequently compounded by historical and systemic racial disparities. You cannot comprehensively look at poverty without looking at race.
Indeed. The text analyzes these disparities with profound detail and data. When looking at the root causes of race-based poverty, Riker argues one cannot ignore the long shadow historical impacts of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade.
By the compounding effect.
These historical events established massive global wealth disparities that have echoed and compounded across generations. Wealth is generational, but so is the deprivation of wealth. And the modern data reflects this persistent inherited inequality. In the UK today, the statistics are stark. A black child is more than twice as likely to live in relative poverty as a white child.
Twice as likely just based on demographics at birth.
Yes. Furthermore, workplace discrimination remains a highly documented stark barrier to upward mobility. Riker cites statistics showing that 51% of black individuals and 43% of Pakistani and Bangladeshi individuals reported experiencing workplace discrimination in the UK.
Wow.
This isn't just about hurt feelings, it has tangible economic consequences. It severely limits their access to stable, high-paying jobs, promotions, and leadership roles, artificially capping their earning potential regardless of their qualifications or work ethic.
Okay, so given those deeply entrenched, historically rooted disparities, the text explores potential policy responses. Right. But let's play devil's advocate here. Because whenever policies like affirmative action or reparations are brought up, the pushback is massive. Does Riker actually address the critics? Because a lot of people argue that trying to fix historical discrimination with modern policies just creates reverse discrimination or disrupts the current economy too much.
Riker walks a really fine line here. He doesn't take a side, but he rigorously lays out the arguments from both ends of the political spectrum to highlight the immense complexity of addressing race-based economic disparities. On one side of the debate, proponents argue that policies like affirmative action are absolutely essential to level a playing field that is demonstrably tilted.
Okay.
They argue you cannot simply declare equality now and ignore centuries of head starts. Affirmative action is seen as a tool to directly counter ongoing documented discrimination by ensuring minority representation in higher education and corporate leadership. Similarly, proponents of reparations argue they are a necessary calculated compensation for the literal stolen labor and inherited economic disadvantages stemming from historical injustices.
Right. The idea that the wealth of the present was built on the unpaid labor of the past, so a debt is owed.
Exactly. But on the other side of the debate, Riker details the significant concerns raised by critics. They argue forcefully against affirmative action on the grounds of what you termed reverse discrimination. Their argument is that it undermines a purely meritocratic system, suggesting that opportunities should be distributed based solely on individual skill test scores and character, completely blind to race. They argue that factoring race into hiring or admissions creates resentment and compromises efficiency.
And what about the arguments against reparations?
Critics of reparations express deep fears over severe economic disruption. They point to the logistical near impossibility of accurately calculating historical debts across multiple centuries and dispersed populations.
It would be a nightmare to calculate.
Furthermore, they raise philosophical concerns that such policies might foster deeper societal division and racial resentment in the present, rather than the intended cohesion by taxing individuals who had no personal involvement in historical atrocities to pay individuals who did not directly suffer them. The text presents these viewpoints not to endorse one, but to show why legislating our way out of systemic racial poverty is so politically gridlocked.
The complexity is staggering. Every time you try to pull one thread, a dozen others get tangled. And when you factor in the additional struggles of single parenthood on top of all this, what the book aptly calls time poverty, it feels insurmountable. Jack, the single dad paying 2/3 of his income in rent, literally lacks the hours in the day to work his job, parent his child, cook healthy meals, and somehow find time to seek personal advancement or take night classes. Time itself is a luxury he cannot afford.
Which brings us to part 5.
Yes, and the one institution that society always promises will save Jack's kid, the institution that is supposed to level the playing field no matter what your background is, the education system. But reading this book makes you ask, is education actually the great equalizer we think it is, or has it become the great divider?
If we look at the empirical outcomes, rather than the idealistic rhetoric, education currently functions as both, but heavily leans toward the latter for those at the bottom. Riker highlights the income achievement gap, which is perhaps the most damning indictment of our current socioeconomic structure.
The numbers are bad.
The disparity in educational outcomes is shocking. Children from the richest 20% of families are twice as likely to achieve 5 solid GCSEs, which are the foundational academic qualifications in the UK system, compared to the poorest 20%.
So before they even hit adulthood, the game is already skewed 2-1.
And it compounds dramatically as they age. When we look at higher education, those same affluent students are 7 times more likely to attend a top-tier Russell Group university, which are the UK equivalents of the Ivy League. So the educational system, despite its promises of meritocracy, is in many ways operating as an engine that replicates and amplifies the existing inequality of the society it serves. Wealth buys tutors access to better catchment areas, extracurriculars, and a lack of cognitive load, which translates to better test scores.
But wait, people always point to the success stories, right? The book shares the story of Peter Higgs. He was a working-class kid from Bristol, grew up without wealth, but he beat the odds, made it into Cambridge University, and eventually won a Nobel Prize in physics. It's an incredibly inspiring story. The media loves stories like Peter's because it validates the system. It says, look, if you work hard enough, you can make it.
And Peter Higgs' story is genuinely remarkable, but the text is quick to caution the reader against using survivorship bias to evaluate systemic efficiency. Stories like Peter's are the exception, the statistical anomaly. They are not the rule.
Right.
The broader, far more sobering reality that we cannot ignore is that 1 in 3 UK children are currently living in poverty. You cannot rely on every third child possessing Nobel laureate levels of genius to escape their circumstances.
Exactly. Expecting everyone in poverty to be a superhero just to reach baseline stability is absurd. And Riker points out that from a purely cold, hard economic standpoint, leaving these kids behind is a massive, self-inflicted wound for the nation. It's bad business. The book cites a study published by the OECD showing that if the UK could simply bring all of its students up to the baseline average math scores, it could boost the national economy by £2 trillion over 20 years. £2 trillion.
It's an astronomical figure.
We are leaving trillions of pounds and millions of brilliant minds on the table because we allow poverty to stunt their educational development.
That staggering economic potential is exactly why Riker argues we must urgently look at alternative educational models. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text contrasts the highly rigid, test-heavy, hyper-competitive UK and US systems with Finland's egalitarian model.
I found the Finland section fascinating. It's like the polar opposite of how we do things.
It truly is a paradigm shift. In Finland, formal academic education doesn't even start until age 7. Before that, it's play-based learning to foster social skills and curiosity. There is virtually no standardized testing until the teenage years, completely removing that early anxiety.
Oh, no testing.
And crucially, there is no segregation or streaming by ability in the early years. Every child, regardless of background, receives the same high quality, comprehensively state funded education. The entire pedagogy focuses on collaboration and holistic development rather than high stakes competition and ranking, and their global educational outcomes consistently top the charts.
It sounds idyllic, but the book also plays the skeptic. It questions whether we can actually just copy-paste that model into the UK or the US. Finland is a relatively homogeneous, smaller population. Our cultural differences, our levels of baseline inequality, and our political structures are vastly different. Are the differences too vast to bridge? The book also looks at the American approach, specifically the charter school model. These are publicly funded but independently run schools, often targeted specifically at disrupting failing educational bureaucracies in deeply disadvantaged urban areas.
And that introduces a whole different set of intense debates regarding the privatization of education.
Right, because when you bring private entities, management organizations, and sometimes for-profit motives into the educational sphere, there is always this inherent tension. What is their primary motive? Is it purely student welfare, or is it corporate profit, market share, and administrative salaries?
Yeah.
Riker does a great job showing that there's no magic bullet. But the bottom line remains, if education fails to act as that engine for social mobility, if it fails to lift Jack's child out of poverty, the burden inevitably falls on the government safety net to catch everyone who slips through the cracks.
Which leads us directly into part 6, an analysis of the modern welfare state. We have to ask the difficult question, is the welfare system a true safety net, or has it inadvertently become a trap of its own making? The UK welfare system has undergone a massive structural evolution since those post-war Beveridge days. It began with noble ideals of universal benefit support provided to all citizens essentially as a basic human right like child benefits or universal health care. But over the decades driven by economic pressures and shifting political ideologies, it has steadily shifted toward means-tested benefits.
Means testing meaning you only get help if you can legally, bureaucratically prove you are desperately poor enough to need it.
Exactly. Support becomes strictly targeted. The most recent and massive iteration of this in the UK is universal credit, which was an ambitious attempt to simplify the system by rolling multiple complex benefits, housing, unemployment, child tax credits, into a single monthly payment.
But the execution of universal credit has been incredibly controversial, to put it mildly. And this brings up a concept that blew my mind. The welfare trap. We talked about James the Working Poor. The welfare trap is this maddening, counterintuitive phenomenon where the system actually punishes you for trying to work. Imagine you are on benefits and you manage to secure a few extra hours at work, or you get a slight pay bump. You think, great, I'm climbing out. But because of the way means testing tapers off your benefits, are slashed disproportionately to your new earnings.
It creates a massive disincentive.
The text describes scenarios where, for every extra pound you earn, you might lose 60 or 70 pence in benefits. Plus, you now have to pay for childcare and commuting. You are literally financially penalized for trying to work your way out of poverty. It's like trying to climb a greased ladder. It acts as a massive psychological and economic disincentive to labor.
It's a structural flaw with devastating human consequences. And the text impartially examines the broader political mechanisms behind this environment, specifically including the impact of government austerity measures over the last decade. Austerity involves broad, sweeping cuts to public funding and social services to reduce the national deficit. But alongside austerity came the introduction of strict conditionality and highly punitive sanctions within the welfare system.
What does that look like on the ground?
It means claimants must meet incredibly stringent bureaucratic requirements, attending endless job center meetings, applying for dozens of jobs a week, logging their activities online. If they fail to meet these conditions, even due to a missed bus, a lack of internet access, or a misunderstanding of complex rules, their financial lifelines are cut or suspended through sanctions. Critics of this approach argue fiercely that these sanctions don't motivate people. They simply push the most vulnerable individuals into absolute desperate destitution, food bank reliance, and even survival crime.
Right, but to be fair to the text, it also presents the other side. Proponents of conditionality argue that sanctions are a necessary tool to ensure the system isn't abused to protect the taxpayer and to provide the necessary stick to push people towards self-sufficiency and away from long-term dependency.
Exactly. Riker lays out both arguments. However, he also delves into how public perception shapes these policies.
And what I found really powerful was the discussion on how the media heavily influences this reality. The book references Dr. Ruth Patrick's sociological work, on the deeply damaging scrounger narrative. We've all seen the tabloid headlines. Certain segments of the media and opportunistic politicians aggressively stigmatize welfare claimants. They paint a picture of them as lazy, manipulative opportunists living a life of luxury on the taxpayer's dime rather than accurately portraying them as desperate people struggling against a broken, complex system. This narrative manufactures public consent for harsher sanctions and deeper austerity cuts.
To illuminate alternative paths, the text contrasts the UK approach with international models. For instance, it looks at Denmark's flexicurity model.
Flexicurity, flexibility and security. How does that work?
It's a fascinating hybrid. It combines extremely high unemployment security and generous benefits for workers who lose their jobs with very relaxed labor market regulations that allow businesses to hire and fire employees easily. The logic is that businesses aren't afraid to hire because they can downsize if needed, and workers aren't terrified of losing their jobs because the safety net is incredibly robust and focused on aggressive retraining. It balances personal safety with a highly dynamic, adaptable economy.
Contrast that with the U.S. approach. Riker looks at the 1996 TANF reforms, temporary assistance for needy families. This was the famous end of welfare as we know it era. It instituted strict lifetime limits on benefits and heavily pushed mandatory work requirements. And the result was complex. While it technically reduced the number of people on the welfare rolls, giving politicians a win, studies show it drastically deepened the severity of extreme poverty for those who couldn't find work and fell off the rolls entirely. It removed the safety net without providing a ladder.
This complex history raises critical questions about the future trajectory of the UK. The text invites the reader to consider how macro-level political shifts are going to stress this system further. Brexit, for instance, fundamentally alters the labor market supply chains, and inflation, all of which put varying pressures on welfare demands. Furthermore, regional devolution is creating a fascinating patchwork of approaches within the UK itself.
Right, the UK isn't just one monolithic policy machine anymore.
Precisely. Scotland, for example, has utilized its devolved powers to chart a slightly different course. They have aggressively pushed for a true living wage, rolled out the Scottish child payment to directly tackle child poverty, and have shown a willingness to experiment with more progressive social policies compared to Westminster. This decentralization means Scotland might act as the vital testing ground for the future of British welfare.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because everything we've talked about so far, tweaking universal credit, adjusting minimum wage, changing school testing, these are all piecemeal reforms. They are patching holes in a sinking ship. But part 7 of the book dives into radical futuristic policy solutions that aim to build a new ship entirely. Specifically, we're talking about universal basic income and progressive taxation. I have to admit, I totally geeked out over the history of UBI. We tend to think of it as a modern Silicon Valley tech bro idea to deal with AI. But Riker shows it has deep cross-ideological roots. Thomas Paine was advocating for a citizen's dividend in the 18th century based on the shared natural resources of the earth. And even the legendary conservative free market economist Milton Friedman proposed a version of it through what he called a negative income tax.
It is a concept that appeals to both libertarians who want to shrink bureaucratic government and progressives who want to guarantee human dignity. And the modern empirical trials of UBI discussed in the text are indeed fascinating.
Let's talk about the data because it dispels a lot of myths. Finland ran a highly publicized trial where they gave 2,000 unemployed people 560 euros a month, completely unconditionally. No strings attached, no job search requirements. And what did they find? The critics said people would just drink it away or sleep all day. But the data showed it significantly lowered psychological stress, improved mental well-being, and massively increased trust in societal institutions without decreasing employment levels.
And then there's the Canadian trial.
Yes, even more striking was the trial in Hamilton, Canada. In their UBI experiment, researchers saw a 46% drop in hospitalizations among the recipients, particularly for severe mental health crises. A 46% drop. That is a massive public health victory that saves the state money in the long run.
The human outcomes are compelling. Yet, as Riker impartially points out, implementing such radical solutions at a national level requires unprecedented levels of funding. You cannot give every citizen a monthly stipend without a massive structural change in revenue. This brings us directly to the fiercely contested debate on progressive taxation and wealth distribution. The text breaks this down by comparing international approaches. On one hand, you have the Nordic or Scandinavian model.
High progressive taxes, comprehensive, social services.
Exactly. They have high, steeply progressive income taxes, robust corporate taxation, and in return, the state provides comprehensive, high quality social services like free universal health care, heavily subsidized childcare. Proponents argue this is the most effective proven way to address extreme wealth concentration and maintain a strong societal contract. And the results speak for themselves. These nations consistently hold the highest global rankings in citizen happiness, social mobility, and economic stability.
But again, can we just import that? Riker looks at the failures too.
Yes, the text examines France's implementation of a highly aggressive wealth tax on its richest citizens. The intention was progressive wealth redistribution. However, the reality was massive capital flight. Wealthy individuals utilizing the mobility of modern finance simply moved their assets, their businesses, and themselves abroad to neighboring countries with friendlier tax regimes. The tax ultimately failed to generate the projected revenue and arguably hurt domestic investment. This case study highlights the incredibly delicate balancing act policymakers face in a globalized world. How do you achieve equitable taxation without triggering capital flight and destroying your competitive economy?
And the debate around UBI itself is equally polarized, even beyond how to pay for it. The book lays it out completely impartially. The optimistic utopian view is that UBI fundamentally emancipates people from wage slavery. It removes the baseline paralyzing terror of basic survival. If you know your rent and food are covered, you have the psychological breathing room to pursue higher education care for a sick family member or take the risk of starting an innovative small business. It unleashes human potential.
But the text also details what is termed the dependency dilemma.
Right. Hold on. If we just give people money, won't prices
Oh,
just go
yeah.
up?
That is the primary economic fear. Critics fear that injecting massive amounts of unconditional money into the economy will lead to rampant inflation, specifically in essentials like housing, completely negating the value of the UBI. Furthermore, there are philosophical fears of societal stagnation. If work is no longer required for survival, will humanity lose its drive and purpose? There is also a highly nuanced mathematical concern regarding the structure of UBI. If you give a flat payment of £1,000 a month to a homeless individual and the exact same £1,000 to a billionaire CEO, you might actually be mathematically widening the inequality gap if you had to cut other targeted welfare programs like disability support or housing vouchers in order to fund that universal flat payment. The poorest might actually end up worse off.
It's a massive risk. But Riker makes the case in Part 8 that the urgency of exploring these radical solutions is being forced upon us whether we like it or not. We don't have the luxury of theorizing forever because we are standing on the precipice of the post-industrial economy. The fourth industrial revolution is here, and the traditional labor market is undergoing a seismic, irreversible shift.
The technological displacement of labor is perhaps the greatest socioeconomic challenge of the coming century.
The text drops a study from the University of Oxford that is absolutely terrifying if we don't have a transitional plan. It estimates that 47% of U.S. jobs are at high risk of automation in the coming decades, almost half the workforce. We aren't just talking about factory assembly lines anymore. We're talking about AI automating legal research accounting, logistics, trucking, and even creative work.
It is a profound structural transition. Post-industrialization and the rise of advanced artificial intelligence have the dual potential to either drastically deepen global poverty by displacing millions of workers without offering new roles, or to create unprecedented avenues for wealth generation and human leisure. A critical battleground in determining which future we get is the digital divide.
Internet access.
The text notes a World Bank report showing that just a 10% increase in broadband internet penetration yields a 1.2% boost in national economic growth. In the modern era, internet access is as fundamental to economic participation as electricity or roads. If marginalized poor communities are locked out of digital literacy, coding skills, and basic hardware access, they will be entirely permanently left behind by a new economy that is increasingly dominated by algorithms, tech startups, and billion-dollar Silicon Valley unicorns.
But what I love about Riker's book is that it doesn't just leave us wallowing in doom and gloom about Skynet taking our jobs. It pivots to highlight incredibly successful, localized, community-driven models that are fighting back against these trends right now. We don't have to wait for the federal government to solve everything. The book looks at the U.S. Job Corps, which provides comprehensive free vocational training and housing to disadvantaged youth. And in the UK, there's the Kickstart scheme.
The Kickstart scheme is a great example of targeted intervention.
Riker tells this amazing story of Greenlee, a young man from a deeply disadvantaged background in Birmingham. He was facing long-term unemployment and the typical traps of his neighborhood. but he secured a 6-month paid placement through the Kickstart scheme at a local tech firm. He gained vital modern tech skills, built a professional network, and completely changed his life trajectory. He is now a junior developer. We also see massive global community efforts like the Harlem Children's Zone in New York. They take a holistic approach, tackling poverty from literal birth through college within a specific geographic zone, providing charter schools, health clinics, and parenting classes all integrated together. And internationally, organizations like BRC in Bangladesh empower local women to lead their own micro-enterprise and poverty alleviation programs.
These community-driven models are vital, and they prompt us to consider alternative, more democratic economic structures for the future. As AI generates massive wealth, how can we ensure that wealth is democratized rather than hyper-concentrated? The text explores the concept of cooperative economics models like community-owned enterprises and worker-owned cooperatives. In a traditional corporate structure, the profits of automation go strictly to the shareholders. But by giving workers equity profit sharing and a democratic voice in the management of their workplaces, we can ensure that the massive productivity gains generated by the Fourth Industrial Revolution are distributed among the many, creating a resilient middle class rather than a handful of tech oligarchs.
And when we talk about community organizations stepping up to fight poverty, we absolutely have to discuss the final major pillar in this deep dive: the historical and modern role of faith-based and religious organizations. This is part 9 of the book. And Riker explores this incredibly rich, complex historical context. Because for centuries, long before the Beveridge Report, long before the state ever considered stepping in to provide a safety net, religious charity was the only safety net. If you fell on hard times, your survival depended on faith-based institutions. From the medieval Catholic monasteries providing alms and medical care, to the destitute to the Victorian soup kitchens and Salvation Army shelters, feeding the urban poor during the Industrial Revolution.
And it is crucial to recognize that their modern footprint remains absolutely immense. We aren't just talking about history. To give scale, the text notes that Catholic Charities in the U.S. alone served over 8 million people in 2016. They're providing disaster relief, running massive food banks, and managing homeless shelters. Furthermore, Riker points out that deeply held religious principles often drive some of the most innovative, successful economic models for poverty alleviation. He highlights the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, founded by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus. The Grameen Bank essentially revolutionized the concept of microfinance by providing tiny collateral-free loans to the absolute poorest citizens, predominantly women, to start small businesses. Yunus has explicitly linked the foundational ethos of this bank to Islamic and broader religious principles of community, uplift mutual support, and the moral duty to eradicate extreme poverty.
An incredible achievement. But the text doesn't shy away from the controversies and the philosophical frictions here, does it?
No, it doesn't. And this raises an important question regarding the inherent historical tension between the concept of charity and the concept of social justice. Riker impartially analyzes the age-old, deeply ingrained religious dichotomy of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. Historically, many faith-based institutions operate on the idea that assistance should be contingent on a demonstration of moral virtue sobriety or adherence to a specific doctrine. If you were deemed immoral, you were cut off.
Right, there are strings attached to the soup.
Precisely. Furthermore, the text explores a significant broader socio-political criticism that massive reliance on religious charity often only treats the immediate visible symptoms of poverty, feeding the hungry today, sheltering the homeless tonight. While noble and immediately necessary critics argue that charity fundamentally fails to challenge or dismantle the systemic structural causes of economic exploitation, wage theft, or political disenfranchisement that actually created the poverty in the first place.
It's the ultimate teach a man to fish debate, but applied to massive societal structures. Giving someone a fish keeps them alive today, but if the river they are fishing in has been privatized and polluted by a massive corporation, giving them a fishing rod doesn't solve the structural problem. They need systemic change. And Riker points out a really concerning modern trend. As governments face tighter budgets and ideological shifts toward austerity, we are seeing a rise in what the book calls compassionate conservatism and an increased reliance on faith-based welfare.
This is a critical observation of the modern political landscape.
Essentially, what we are seeing is the secular state intentionally rolling back its welfare provisions, cutting funding for state-run shelters and food programs, and increasingly relying on religious NGOs, local churches, and private charities to plug the massive gaping holes left in the societal safety net. It fundamentally forces you as a citizen to ask a profound question. Is it the state's constitutional obligation to ensure its citizens don't starve to death in the streets? Or is it the church's moral job? If it's the state's job, they are outsourcing their responsibility.
To synthesize all these intricate interlocking threads we've discussed over the last hour, what Conrad Reicher's Escaping the Poverty Trap masterfully, undeniably demonstrates is that poverty, whether in the UK, the US, or globally, is a multifaceted systemic trap. It is an interlocking mechanism, it is the psychological devastation of cognitive load, it is the physical deterioration from a postcode lottery, it is persistent historical legacy of racial and geographic barriers. It is an educational system that frequently amplifies inequity, and it is a policy landscape of welfare traps and political gridlock. Breaking out of this labyrinth requires us to move far, far beyond the simplistic, dismissive narrative of simply demanding more individual grit. It demands comprehensive, empathetic, evidence-based structural changes to our fundamental societal contract.
It is a massive amount of information to process, but it's so necessary if we actually want to understand the world we live in. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought that builds on everything we've just discussed, something that Riker hints at but that we all need to grapple with. Let's imagine a utopian near future where we actually do it. Let's say we implement a robust universal basic income, we institute fair progressive taxation and advanced AI automates all the tedious, dangerous labor. We effectively solve the mathematical financial aspect of the poverty trap. Everyone has a house, everyone has food. What happens next? Will the new unforeseen poverty trap of the 21st century not be a lack of money, but a lack of purpose, a lack of meaning, and a lack of human connection in a world where our traditional economic output is no longer required by society? How do we find our self-worth when our labor is obsolete? It is definitely something deep to mull over.
It's the next great challenge.
Thank you so much for joining us on this massive, incredibly important journey today. Please do not forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts on UBI, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive. I cannot recommend this source material enough. Please go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now and purchase Escaping the Poverty Trap by Conrad Reicher. Dig into the data yourself, and when you finish it, drop a 5-star review, as it hugely helps authors get their work seen. Finally, for more brilliant ongoing socioeconomic insights, make sure you open up Substack and go follow @Conrad Reicher. Until next time, keep questioning the systems around you, keep learning, and take care.